Hey guys, Coach Barreline coming at you with your next video lesson on World War One. The war, much as war often does, dramatically changes society in the United States. And in fact, the United States mobilization of the war is going to be unlike anything that is seen in American history before that time. Ironically enough, or coincidentally enough, the United States had kind of invented this idea of total war during the Civil War, but it's going to ramp up to a whole new level during this time period in World War One. It's going to impact all aspects of American life. So obviously, economy is one place we're going to see the impacts of the war. The war effort was extremely expensive. The government was searching for ways to pay for it. So taxes were one area in which the government did that. Congress passed the War Revenue Act of 1917, which passed very high taxes that taxed wealthy Americans up to 77% of their incomes, and it also and this increased federal revenues by 400% within just 2 years. Also, another way of funding the war effort was through loans and Liberty bonds. Wilson sparked an intense campaign to sell Liberty bonds. And basically, Liberty bonds, or any government bond, is a loan to the person who buys the bond. Basically saying that, if you hold this bond for X number of years, we'll pay you back plus interest. Now, during the war, the national debt grows from $1.2 billion to $25.5 billion in just 3 years. So you're talking about a 1,200% increase over this time period. Also, regulating industry is another way in which the economy changes by the government becoming more involved. Congress creates administrative boards to prepare industries for war. So the War Industries Board basically regulates the manufacture and sale of all war materials, and it increases industrial production by 20%. Regulating food was obviously important because we had to feed the army and still be able to feed ourselves as a nation. So Congress passes the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act. And this lets the government set prices and establish production controls on all agricultural products, specifically food products. Herbert Hoover, who was the head of the Food Administration, basically promised farmers higher prices for their crops, and asked Americans to eat less and consume less of those crops, and basically to plant gardens, which become known as Liberty Gardens, rather than buying food at the store, which can then be used, which could be used for the troops. People would grow their own food at home. Prohibition also helped the war because less alcohol was used. Less alcohol was produced for consumption and drinking, so that those crops like grapes and wheat, corn that might otherwise go into producing alcohol are going to produce foodstuffs for the troops. 1919, the Volstead Act passed. Prohibition as the temperance movement gained strength. The 18th Amendment had outlawed the sale and production of alcohol, and the Volstead Act in 1919 is the law passed by Congress and signed into law by President Wilson that basically enforces that constitutional amendment. Another place where regulations come in handy during the war effort is regulating fuel. The Fuel Administration was established, set up production goals and prices for fuel, much like in the agricultural area. Son of former President James A. Garfield, Harry Garfield, headed the administration, and he's the guy that's responsible for the introduction of daylight savings times. The idea was it could extend hours for factory workers with longer shifts, extend daylight hours. He also promoted fuel conservation by encouraging Americans to go without gas and heat on certain days, to turn their thermostats down at night or when they would leave the house. And there are all sorts of efforts that were put forward. All right, so mobilizing workers was important because the American economy couldn't couldn't handle work stoppages during the increased production that would be necessary to fuel the war effort. So during the war, the profits of many of these companies skyrocketed because they, in a sense, became contractors for the federal government. This created enormous profits for the steel, oil, and chemical industry specifically. And factory wages increased, but the rising cost of food because of the higher guaranteed prices by the government means that workers actually aren't gaining much ground. So the war demands also led laborers to working longer hours, more dangerous conditions, in order to produce these materials needed on time. The harsh conditions did lead many workers to join labor unions, and union membership increases during the war by about 60%, and unions boomed with more than 6,000 strikes held during the war. The National War Labor Board was established by President Wilson to try to keep these strikes from disrupting the war effort. And basically, the National War Labor Board goes and mediates, arbitrates between strikers and management to try to end these strikes. Now this leads to the handling of over 1,200 cases during the war years. And also to improve conditions, the National War Labor Board establishes the first 8-hour workday, sought companies to recognize unions, and urged equal pay for women. Now, women, of course, make huge contributions to the war effort. As men leave their jobs to fight, and millions, women move into those jobs in many cases to keep the American economy moving. Women took many jobs traditionally held by men on the railroads, factories, docks, all those types of things, as well as building ships and airplanes and weapons and things of that nature for the war effort. By all told, over 1 million women joined the workforce during the war. They also filled their traditional jobs as nurses and teachers that they had done for years in larger numbers. African Americans also flocked to factories in industrial cities throughout the South and especially to the North to fill these new jobs in factories. And the mass migration of black Americans from the rural South to southern and especially northern cities will become the first wave of what becomes known as the Great Migration. And by the end of the Great Migration, you're going to have literally tens of millions of blacks have moved to industrial cities and to southern cities too as well, and it creates a huge shift in the African American population throughout the United States. One of the biggest impacts of the war in the United States is the influenza. You had 3 waves of severe flu epidemics break out between 1918 and 1919 in Europe and in America. All the American troops who died in World War I, half died just from influenza. That's not even other diseases or other kinds of things, but half of them die from influenza. On the Western Front, you had crowded, unsanitary trenches, and flu spread quickly among troops. And what happens is those soldiers brought the flu back from the war with them to American military camps in Kansas and other areas, and then it begins to spread to the general population. The strain of influenza was at the time was called the Spanish influenza, was deadly. It killed healthy people within days, and during the month of October 1918 alone, influenza killed nearly 200,000 Americans in 1 month. Panic city leaders halted gatherings. People accused the Germans of releasing flu germs into the population. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories and things of that nature. By the time it passed, over 600,000 Americans lost their lives in the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919, which is far and away more than more Americans that were killed in the war itself. Another way in which we see the government changing its role in people's lives is this campaign to convince people to support the war. Many Americans had favored neutrality, so Wilson creates the Committee on Public Information, which appointed reporter and former George Creel as the leader. And Creel begins this propaganda campaign: posters, news stories, speeches, other radio shows, other types of things, movies that are intended to influence opinion to support the war. He hires movie stars to speak, artists to create patriotic posters. Of course, the most famous poster is the James Montgomery flag picture of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you for the U.S. Army." Some Americans began to distrust German things as a result. Much of this propaganda depicted the Germans as animalistic and bloodthirsty, and there was quite a backlash against German Americans. Many schools stopped teaching the German language, and symphonies stopped playing German music. If you could tell me what a symphony plays, if they can't play Bach or Beethoven, you got me. German-sounding names were changed, so sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, hamburgers became Liberty steak, kind of like, in the Iraq War when France didn't want to help the United States. People started saying stuff like freedom fries and freedom toast and all that junk. So reporters spread that German secret agents were operating in the United States, and this caused many Americans to discriminate against the German Americans, most of whom whose families had lived in the United States for decades. Certainly my family, the Bearlines, living in Lancaster, Kentucky, would have been a suspect class during this time. One of the most shameful aspects of the war, probably, however, is the government's limitation of Americans' right to free speech. Prominent Americans such as pacifist reformer Jane Addams and Senator La Follette, who we spoke about before, did speak out against the war. Addams founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and Wilson and his administration tried to limit public speech about the war. With the help of Congress, they signed into law the Espionage Act, which punished people for aiding the enemy or even for refusing military duty as conscientious objectors. The year after it passed, Congress also passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal for Americans to criticize the government, flag, or military in speech or writing. So this was a huge overstepping of federal authority to restrict free speech. More than 1,000 opponents of the war were jailed under those acts, including a director named Robert Goldstein, who directed a film called The Spirit of 1776 about the American Revolution. But since the British were our allies during World War I, the government wanted him to take out scenes of British brutality because it would reflect poorly on them now. He refused, and he was actually arrested. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for criticizing the Espionage Act, but was later released after the war. Of course, many Americans felt like these were violations of the First Amendment. Others, on the other hand, thought that they were essential to protect military secrets and American safety. The Supreme Court also struggled with this. This was a debate going on there. In one case, Charles Schenck, an official of the American Socialist Party, organized the printing of 15,000 leaflets opposing the war, and he was convicted of violating the Espionage Act. He challenged the conviction of the Supreme Court, but the court upheld his conviction, limiting free speech during World War I. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote the court's unanimous decision, one of the most famous Supreme Court justices of all time, and he says, some things that can be said safely in peacetime can be dangerous to the country during wartime. So the drastic limiting of personal liberty for Americans during the war in the name of the war effort. And so you got economic change, you've got social change, with women becoming more involved in the workforce, African Americans moving to different places in the United States as a result of the war. Certainly have political change with the growth of government authority and power, and the limiting of civil liberties for individual Americans. So World War I has a massive impact on the United States, and really creates, you could argue, creates the modern United States. As we know it today, or as we've come to learn about it today, World War I creates the modern U.S. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll bring the war to a close, talk about the U.S.'s impact on the war effort, and continue to talk about the peace and how the Treaty of Versailles, it becomes problematic, becomes controversial, and ultimately how the problems of post-war of post-World War I world are going to lead to World War II eventually. We'll talk to you later. Bye.